It was one of those nights where the darkness feels heavier than usual. A thick or almost tangible blanket pressing down on your senses says. Even though the streetlights flickered occasionally outside, casting their weak orange glow through the blinds, it did little to soothe the creeping unease that had settled in. Some nights, you might tell yourself you're imagining things, that the quiet of an empty house is merely amplifying your thoughts. But tonight, it felt different. There was a sharp, almost imperceptible sound in the corner of the living room. Something that didn't belong. I had been scrolling through my phone to distract myself. The familiar glow, a small comfort against the pitch of the night. But the sound made my chest tighten. It was a Yes, sir. It's a subtle scuffle, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator, yet enough to make my heart leap. I froze, listening. The usual creaks of the old apartment weren't enough to explain it. I convinced myself it was probably a rat, maybe even a branch tapping against the window outside. Anything rational that could ground me. But as the minutes stretched, a second sound echoed, this time closer, almost deliberate. Something was moving in my apartment. I told myself it had to be a trick of the mind. But the sudden cold wash of fear crawling up my spine said otherwise. I reached for the flashlight on the kitchen counter, feeling the smooth metal under my fingers. Each step towards the living room seemed louder than the last, as if my own nervousness had amplified every creak in the old wooden floorboards. Peeking around the corner, I saw nothing. The room was empty, bathed in the soft light of the street lamp outside. My pulse began to slow, the adrenaline fading just slightly, replaced by a gnawing curiosity and unease. That's when I noticed the small pile of keys on the coffee table had shifted, barely an inch, yet unmistakably moved. My breath hitched, my mind racing through every possible explanation. I had lived here for years, and nothing like this had ever happened. Slowly, almost unwillingly, I stepped forward. The air felt thicker, charged, like the apartment itself was holding its breath. By now, I was completely alert, senses heightened. Every sound, the hum of the fridge, the distant honk of a car outside, even the soft rustle of curtains in the faint breeze, was amplified. I checked the closets, one by one, opening each door carefully. Flashlight sweeping across the empty shelves and coats hanging neatly. Nothing. No sign of intrusion. No sign of life other than my own panicked heartbeat echoing in my ears. And yet, the feeling of being watched remained, pressing against the back of my mind like a silent, suffocating weight. It wasn't until I returned to the living room that I noticed it. A single chair had been turned around, facing the window. I was certain I had left it angled toward the kitchen earlier, yet now it faced the darkened glass as though someone had been sitting there, waiting. My stomach churned, a mix of fear and disbelief. I thought about calling someone, anyone, But what would I even say? There's someone in my apartment, but they're gone now. The thought of making that call and revealing my vulnerability only made the hair on my arms rise further. I tried to rationalize it, to calm myself with the familiar words of logic, but deep down, I knew something was off. Later that night, sleep became impossible. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the window sent me into a state of heightened alert. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that my mind was simply playing tricks in the solitude of my apartment. But the shadows seemed to shift differently now, as if aware of my scrutiny. And then came the second incident, a thud from the bedroom, followed by the soft shuffle of fabric. My breath caught. I hadn't moved anything in there. Slowly, cautiously, I crept toward the door, flashlight trembling slightly in my grasp. The bedroom was empty. I checked under the bed, behind the dresser, every conceivable hiding place. Nothing. And yet, the bed itself was no longer as I had left it. The corner of the sheets had been pulled back, as though someone had lain down, just for a moment, right where I always sleep. My pulse hammered against my ribcage, and for the first time, panic set in. I wanted to leave, to abandon the apartment entirely. But my car keys sat on the counter, and the street outside felt impossibly far. I was trapped in the silence of my own home, a place that had once been a sanctuary. The next few nights brought more of the same. Subtle movements of objects, faint noises just out of reach, the unshakable feeling that someone was there, watching, waiting. I began leaving small cameras around the apartment, hidden among books and potted plants, hoping to capture proof of whatever intruder haunted my nights. Days passed with nothing, yet my anxiety only grew, festering into a quiet obsession. Each night, I would check the locks multiple times, double-check the windows, ensure the stove was off. Yet the sense of violation persisted. Something or someone had crossed into my life in a way that I could neither see nor fully comprehend. One evening, I returned home from work to find a note slipped under my door. The handwriting was messy, uneven, yet eerily familiar. "I know you're alone tonight," it read. No signature, no explanation. Just those words, scrawled in black ink. My hands shook as I picked it up, the paper crumpling slightly under my grip. I felt exposed, violated in a way that went beyond mere fear. The apartment no longer felt like a home, but a stage on which someone else could move unseen, observing my every step. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss it as a prank. Yet everything, the noises, the moved objects, the sudden cold chills, pointed to something far more sinister. That night, I slept in the living room, fully dressed, flashlight clutched tightly in my hand. Every sound was magnified. The hum of the refrigerator, the occasional groan of the floorboards, the faint tick of the clock. Hours passed like minutes, And still, sleep eluded me. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard someone whisper my name, just barely audible over the emptiness. I froze, heart hammering, convinced my mind had created the sound. Then, a shadow passed across the hallway. Slow, deliberate, impossible to ignore. My breath caught, chest tight with terror, and I realized I was no longer alone. The following morning, police were called after I discovered clear signs of intrusion, objects out of place, traces of someone else's presence that I could no longer deny. The investigation revealed the horrifying truth. Someone had been living in my apartment without my knowledge, accessing my space when I slept, moving silently, integrating themselves into my life unnoticed. The realization that a stranger had been so close, so intimate with my personal world, left me trembling. My home, my sanctuary, had been invaded in the most invasive, terrifying way imaginable. And yet, even after the perpetrator was caught, the psychological impact lingered. Every creak of the floor, every shifting shadow brought back memories of that suffocating fear. Even the most familiar corners of my apartment became battlegrounds of anxiety, a constant reminder that safety is often an illusion. That night, that fear, that presence unseen, it stayed with me long after the intruder was gone. It was the kind of night where the city felt dead, the usual hum of traffic replaced by an oppressive silence. The street outside my apartment was empty, shadows stretching unnaturally across the pavement under the dim glow of the street lamps. I had just finished a late shift at work, exhausted and craving the comfort of home. Yet a subtle unease had settled in as soon as I stepped inside. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. I shrugged it off at first, telling myself the long hours and fatigue were making my senses sharper than usual. But that calm, rational thought didn't last. The first sign that night was subtle, almost dismissible. A door in my apartment, the one leading to the small storage closet, was slightly ajar. I was certain I had closed it before leaving that morning. I froze in the hallway, every muscle tensed, listening. The apartment was silent. I carefully approached, gripping the handle with a shaking hand, and pushed it open. Nothing, just the familiar clutter of boxes and old shoes. My heart slowed slightly, but an icy feeling remained in the pit of my stomach. I closed the door, convinced I had simply forgotten to shut it properly. Minutes later, I settled on the couch with a cup of tea, trying to calm myself with the normalcy of a nightly routine. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, and the soft rustle of the curtains should have been comforting. Instead, each sound seemed to carry an undercurrent of menace. That's when I heard it. A soft footstep from the bedroom. Just one. Quick, deliberate. My head snapped in that direction, eyes wide. The bedroom door was closed. I hadn't moved a thing in there, and no one else was supposed to be home. Panic settled in like a lead weight. I tried to rationalize. Perhaps it was the neighbor above, their footsteps echoing oddly in the building's creaky structure. But no, the sound had come from within my own apartment. A cold sweat coated my arms as I slowly made my way toward the bedroom. The door handle was cold under my hand. My breath came in shallow gasps as I twisted it open. The room was empty, the bed neatly made as I had left it. But then, I noticed the slight shift. The sheets on the left side of the bed, where I never slept, were creased, as if someone had lain there recently. My heart raced. I backed out of the room slowly, mind spinning through every possible explanation. It had to be a prank, I told myself. But who would know I lived here alone? And how could they enter without leaving any trace? A sense of violation crept through me. Sharp and cold, I spent the next hour pacing the apartment, checking windows and locks repeatedly, as if somehow reassurance could stem the growing dread. Every creak in the building, every distant sound of traffic, felt amplified, like a warning that something was lurking just out of sight. The next few days were a careful balance of paranoia and forced normalcy. I would go about my routine, trying to convince myself everything was fine, but small, inexplicable incidents kept chipping away at that illusion. A spoon would go missing from the kitchen drawer, only to reappear later in a place I knew I hadn't left it. My shoes were moved slightly out of alignment, the TV remote displaced from the stand where I always kept it. Each tiny anomaly felt like breadcrumbs leading toward a larger, more horrifying truth I wasn't ready to face. It was on a Tuesday night, after another exhausting day, that the situation escalated. I returned home to find the living room in subtle disarray. Books had been shifted, the cushions on the sofa slightly depressed, as if someone had sat there while I was away. A chill ran through me. My first instinct was to leave, but curiosity mingled with fear, forcing me to investigate. I moved slowly, flashlight in hand, checking every corner. Nothing. Every closet, every cabinet was empty. Yet the atmosphere of the apartment had changed entirely. The familiarity I once felt was gone, replaced with a silent, omnipresent tension that made every shadow a potential threat. Later that night, I was jolted awake by the sound of breathing. Soft, uneven, almost imperceptible, coming from the kitchen. My heart pounded and I lay still, straining to identify its source. It was then I noticed the subtle smell, a musky, unfamiliar odor lingering in the room. Faint but unmistakable. It was the smell of someone else. Someone who had been in my space without my knowledge. Trembling, I reached for the flashlight, gripping it tightly, and slowly crept toward the kitchen. The floorboards groaned under my weight, each sound a drumbeat of impending terror. The kitchen was empty. The lights from the street outside cast long, distorted shadows across the countertops, creating shapes that flickered and danced with the slightest movement of the curtains. My mind raced. There had to be a rational explanation. But as I examined the cupboards and drawers, I noticed one of the drawers was slightly ajar. I was certain I had closed it before leaving that morning. My pulse quickened as I opened it fully. Nothing inside, yet the thought of someone rifling through my belongings, unseen, sent shivers down my spine. Sleep became impossible. Each night, I would hear noises that couldn't be explained. Soft shuffling, whispered words that I could never fully catch. Objects displaced in subtle, unnerving ways. The apartment, once a sanctuary, had transformed into a labyrinth of tension and fear. I installed small cameras and motion sensors, hoping to capture evidence of what was happening. Days passed without incident, and I began to doubt my sanity. Perhaps I was imagining it all, my mind exaggerating the ordinary creaks and groans of an aging apartment. Then came the note. Small, folded, slipped under the door while I was at work. I unfolded it with trembling hands. Written in uneven, hurried script were the words, "I see you. I'm here." No signature, no explanation. Just that chilling sentence. I could feel the presence of another, a silent observer who had been moving through my life undetected. My stomach churned. I was living in my own home, yet someone else had been sharing it with me in the most intimate, terrifying way possible. I felt trapped, violated in a manner that went beyond the physical. From that night onward, my behavior changed. I stopped leaving things unattended, double-checked locks obsessively, and avoided accepting packages of food from neighbors. The fear had taken root, an ever-present shadow over my daily life. Even familiar routines, like turning on the kettle or settling on the couch with a book, became moments charged with anxiety. I knew that the person or persons who had been in my apartment before could return, that my sense of security was a fragile illusion easily shattered. Weeks later, police investigation revealed a horrifying reality. Someone had indeed been entering the apartment undetected, living in hidden spaces while I slept, moving silently, watching without my knowledge. The perpetrator had been skillful, patient, and disturbingly intimate in their intrusion. The knowledge that a stranger had been so close, so embedded in my personal world, left me shaken to the core. Even after the threat was removed, the psychological aftermath lingered. Shadows in corners, the faint creak of a floorboard, the whisper of wind against a window, all became triggers, reminders of the unseen presence that had invaded my life. I never felt truly alone again. Every noise at night, every subtle movement reminded me of that time. Even the most mundane household sounds could spark the memory of fear and violation. I had survived, yet the experience had reshaped my perception of safety, leaving me hyper-aware, cautious, and profoundly changed. It was a terrifying reminder that danger is often invisible, integrated seamlessly into the fabric of everyday life, waiting for the moment we least expect. It was a stormy night when the power went out in my neighborhood. The kind of night where darkness seeps into every corner and the world outside feels suspended in time. Rain lashed against the windows, the wind rattling the panes in a rhythm that seemed almost like a warning. I was alone, having forgotten to check my phone battery before the outage, and the usual hum of electronics that fills an apartment with a comforting background noise was gone. In its absence, the silence felt heavy, oppressive, and strangely alive. My first instinct was to light some candles, to create small pockets of light. But as I struck the match and watched the flame flicker, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't truly alone. The first unsettling sign came when I noticed the living room chair, normally pushed in neatly under the small table, was now angled toward the window. I hadn't touched it since earlier in the day. The thought of someone entering my apartment in the midst of the storm made my stomach tighten. I tried to convince myself it was simply the gust of wind or the vibrations of the storm shifting the furniture slightly. But even as I rationalized, my gaze kept drifting back to the chair, each glance sending a shiver down my spine. Something about its position was wrong, almost purposeful, as if someone had been watching through the window. I moved carefully through the apartment, checking each room by candlelight. The shadows danced wildly on the walls, transforming ordinary objects into grotesque silhouettes. Every noise, whether the patter of rain, the hum of the wind, or the distant roll of thunder, felt amplified, loaded with intent. I approached the bedroom door slowly, hand on the knob, and paused to listen. The usual creaks of the apartment were present, but beneath them was another sound, faint and almost imperceptible. A soft scuffing, like shoes on hardwood. I froze, breath shallow, heart hammering. It was coming from inside my own bedroom. I had lived in this apartment for over a year, and nothing had ever happened. I had friends over occasionally, but no one had a key, and the building's security system had always been reliable. And yet, the evidence suggested otherwise. I opened the bedroom door cautiously. The room was empty, but something was undeniably off. My bed, neatly made earlier that evening, had been disturbed, the sheets slightly crumpled on the left side, the side I never slept on. I backed out of the room slowly, each movement deliberate, and my mind raced. Someone had been here while I was distracted or asleep. The realization made my stomach churn. I decided to retreat to the kitchen, hoping a glass of water might calm my nerves. But as I reached for the cabinet, I noticed the faint outline of footprints on the floor. Slightly damp from the rain carried in somehow, leading from the living room to the bedroom. Panic rose in my throat. This wasn't imagination. This was someone moving in my home, unseen, undetected, and dangerously intimate in their intrusion. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but the blackout had rendered it useless. No signal, dead battery, powerless. The storm outside intensified, rain slamming against the windows in heavy sheets, thunder cracking sharply as if punctuating the terror that had settled over my apartment. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time seemed distorted in the darkness. Every sound kept me on edge. Then, around 2 a.m., a soft knock came from the kitchen door. The sound so gentle it could almost be mistaken for the wind. My heart leapt. I whispered to myself that I should leave, that I needed to get out of the apartment. But the storm made venturing outside dangerous. The knock repeated, this time slightly more deliberate, accompanied by a faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound. I gripped a heavy frying pan from the counter, hands trembling, and inched toward the door. What I saw when I turned the corner froze me to my core. Nothing. No one was there. The door was locked from the inside, and yet the noises persisted. I spent the remainder of the night in the living room, every nerve stretched taut, listening to the apartment breathe and creak around me. The storm continued unabated, casting the shadows into sharp relief against the walls. Every gust of wind, every subtle shift in the building seemed like a whisper, a warning, a presence lingering just out of reach. When morning finally arrived, gray and dripping with the remnants of the storm, I dared to explore every inch of my apartment. Drawers were slightly open, small items misplaced. The sense of invasion was overwhelming. It was clear that someone or something had been moving through my life without permission, seamlessly integrating themselves into the spaces I considered private and safe. Over the next few days, I noticed a pattern. Small objects would vanish, only to return to different locations, sometimes subtly altered. My clothes would be moved, personal items shifted, a subtle but undeniable mark of intrusion. The terror was no longer confined to the nighttime hours. It had seeped into every corner of my life. The psychological impact was immense. A gnawing, unshakable fear that someone was constantly present, watching, waiting, and manipulating the spaces I considered my own. Each small anomaly, the moved keys, the shifted chair, the creased sheets, was a thread in a tapestry of dread that I could not unravel. Eventually, I discovered hidden signs of habitation. Faint imprints of a sleeping bag tucked behind a rarely used closet door. Small scraps of food left in corners. Traces of someone using my personal items. The thought that a stranger had been living inside my apartment, within arm's reach, while I was unaware, was unbearable. Sleep became impossible. I began to check locks repeatedly, leaving lights on even during the day, and refusing to leave anything unattended. My home, once a sanctuary, had become a landscape of tension, fear, and hyper-awareness. It was only after an extensive investigation that the truth was revealed. Someone had gained access using a spare key and had been moving through my home for days at a time, observing, manipulating, and integrating into my life without detection. The perpetrator was arrested, but the emotional aftermath lingered far longer than the legal resolution. Every shadow, every faint sound, every subtle movement reminded me of that night and the terror that had silently infiltrated my life. The sense of violation, of intimacy violated, left an indelible mark. Even years later, the experience haunted me. Every storm, every power outage, every flicker of light in the darkness triggered memories of that night. The ordinary became a canvas for fear. A simple chair moved, a crumpled sheet, a faint odor. Anything could signal that presence, unseen but undeniable. The lessons of that night, though learned in terror, were clear. Safety is fragile, and reality can be invaded in ways that are nearly impossible to detect. The mundane can become terrifying, the familiar unsettling, and the boundaries we take for granted can be crossed without warning. The fourth story begins with a simple idea. Staying over at a friend's house for the night. A plan that seemed harmless at first. I had been invited to a small gathering. Just a few close friends in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house was familiar enough. I had visited before, during the day, enjoying their warm hospitality. But as night fell and the group began to disperse, leaving me alone in a guest room, the atmosphere subtly shifted. Shadows pooled in corners, elongated by the soft glow of a single lamp. Silence filled the spaces where laughter had been earlier, and I felt the creeping sense that I was no longer just a visitor in someone else's home. I was being watched. At first, it was minor things, easily dismissed. The closet door, which I had closed earlier, was slightly ajar when I returned from the bathroom. A chair in the corner of the room had been turned around. Small, almost negligible details that anyone might attribute to forgetfulness or a breeze. Yet the growing tension in my chest told me something was wrong. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. After all, I was alone, exhausted, and the house, though familiar, was inherently different at night. Still, I kept noticing subtle irregularities. Objects slightly out of place, faint noises that seemed to echo from the floor above. As midnight approached, the sense of unease intensified. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to will my heartbeat to slow, when I heard it, the faint creak of footsteps in the hallway. My pulse quickened. My friends were supposed to be asleep, or at least on the other side of the house. Yet the sound of deliberate, slow steps echoed just outside the door. I froze, listening. Another step, then another, each more confident, deliberate. Whoever it was knew I was there. The idea that someone had moved through the house unnoticed and with such ease made my skin crawl. I waited, barely breathing, hoping the sound would pass. But then it stopped. Silence. My eyes darted to the door, half expecting it to slowly open. Minutes stretched into an hour. The lamp cast shadows that seemed alive, writhing on the walls with the movement of my own mind. Yet nothing appeared to move. I told myself repeatedly that I was overreacting, that the fear was just my imagination inflating the ordinary. But when I reached to adjust the lamp, I noticed a small folded piece of paper on the floor near the closet. My hand shook as I picked it up. In jagged, hurried writing, it read, "I see you." Panic rose in my chest, thick and unrelenting. I had no idea who could have written it. My friends were kind, trustworthy people. I had no reason to suspect them. And yet, the words on the paper were unmistakably real. A tangible sign that someone had been in the room while I slept. My mind raced, attempting to rationalize, but the fear was undeniable. I resolved to leave immediately, to retreat to the safety of my own home. But as I reached for the doorknob, a shadow moved across the hallway outside. My breath caught. I froze, trying to convince myself it was another trick of the light. The shadow lingered, deliberate, aware of my presence, before slowly retreating back into the darkness. The rest of the night was a tense vigil. I kept the lamp on, flashlight in hand, eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. Each noise, a floorboard creak, a distant hum, the faint whisper of wind against the window, set my nerves on edge. Morning could not come soon enough. When it did, I cautiously explored the house, searching for any sign of intrusion. Nothing overt was found. No broken locks, no forced entry. Yet the sense of violation persisted. Whoever had been in that house had done so with skill, leaving subtle signs that they were present without being caught, manipulating the environment to ensure I felt their presence without tangible proof. Weeks passed, and the experience left a lasting impression. I could not sleep in unfamiliar rooms, could not trust the quiet of an empty house. The psychological impact was profound. A constant hyper-awareness of surroundings and a fear of unseen presence. Simple actions, closing a door, moving a chair, adjusting the blinds, became moments of heightened vigilance. The ordinary, once comforting, became a landscape of subtle terror. Each creak or shadow a potential sign that the experience could repeat itself at any time. The familiar became frightening. The safe spaces contaminated by memory. The fifth story begins with the familiar isolation of a solo camping trip. I had decided to spend a weekend in the wilderness, seeking solitude, peace, and a break from the endless hum of urban life. I pitched my tent near a quiet creek, the sun dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The first night was serene. The gentle rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. But as darkness deepened, the forest seemed to change. Sounds that had once been soothing now carried a threatening edge. The crack of a branch, the whisper of wind through the trees, the soft scuffing of something moving unseen. Each startled me, each hinting at a presence I could neither see nor rationalize. At first I told myself it was an animal. Deer, raccoons, perhaps even a bear in the distance. I kept the fire burning, listening carefully to the rhythm of nature. But as the night wore on, subtle signs began to unsettle me. Footprints appeared near my tent, ones that had not been there when I set up. Small objects, my flashlight, a water bottle, even a piece of clothing, were slightly displaced. The rational mind attempted to justify each occurrence, but the cumulative effect was a growing dread that I could not ignore. Someone or something had been moving near my tent unseen, leaving traces of their presence. The sixth story unfolds with a similar sense of ordinary life invaded by the uncanny. I had been staying at a friend's apartment in the city while they were away for the weekend. The apartment was familiar, comfortable, and I had lived there before without incident. Yet, on the first night alone, I began to notice subtle irregularities. Doors slightly ajar, items moved, and an unshakable feeling of being observed. The sense of presence, invisible yet undeniable, grew with each hour. When I awoke to find the sheets on my bed disturbed, though I had slept alone, the full realization struck. Someone had been inside the apartment while I slept. The seventh story is about an online connection gone wrong. I had been chatting with someone on a dating app, someone who seemed charming, trustworthy, even mundane in their communication. Yet, when we finally met in person, the situation escalated quickly. Subtle red flags, differences in appearance from photos, overconfidence, insistence on guiding me through unfamiliar spaces, layered one atop the other, creating a sense of escalating unease. The encounter culminated in the horrifying realization that this person had been observing and manipulating my environment in ways I had not anticipated, exploiting my trust and familiarity with ordinary situations to create terror. The eighth story begins with a routine solo night at home. I had been cooking dinner, listening to music, when I heard the faintest of noises. The soft shuffle of shoes across the floor in the hallway. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was the apartment settling or a neighbor above. But then came the whisper of breath, the subtle scent of someone else in my space, and the movement of objects. My keys shifted, a chair angled differently, a door ajar that I had closed earlier. The ordinary setting of my home was transformed into a theater of psychological horror. Each detail amplified by the isolation and silence of the night. The ninth story involves a hotel stay during a business trip. I arrived late, exhausted, and alone in a room on the top floor. Initially, everything seemed normal. The quiet, the neutral furnishings, the hum of the city far below. But as night fell, small, inexplicable events began. The television flickered despite being off. Objects subtly moved and faint noises echoed from the hallway. A note appeared on the nightstand, handwritten, unsigned. I'm watching. The combination of isolation, unfamiliar surroundings, and the realization of someone observing without detection created a terrifying sense of vulnerability. The 10th and final story is about a neighbor who appeared overly kind, yet whose presence became increasingly invasive. At first, the neighbor seemed friendly, offering food, conversation, and casual help. But small things began to feel wrong. Items moved in my apartment, strange noises at night, and a persistent, intangible feeling of being watched. The culmination of these experiences revealed a horrifying reality. The neighbor had been entering my home while I slept, leaving traces, moving objects, and creating a sustained psychological terror. The aftermath left lasting effects, teaching that the ordinary can mask danger and that perceived safety can be a fragile illusion. Across all these stories, one theme emerges clearly. Isolation amplifies fear. Ordinary spaces become stages for psychological terror, and the subtle invasion of personal environments can leave an indelible mark on the mind. Safety is often an illusion, and terror can lurk where least expected, transforming familiar settings into landscapes of dread.